latest podcast, The Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
For a guy who was supposed to be a tyrant, Calvin did a very poor job of it.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
Would you tell a friend about the Heidelcast? That'd be great.
The Heidelcast.
For a fellow who's been dead since 1564 and for a movement that, socially considered, is a little more than a demographic blip. There are about 600,000 people in North America who actually agree with Calvin. Calvin and Calvinism continue to receive a remarkable amount of attention in the mass media. Typically, however, this attention draws upon a familiar meme that has its roots in Calvin's earliest critic, Jerome Balzac, who died in 1584, who was a former Carmelite monk converted to the Protestant cause, but who opposed Calvin's doctrine of salvation beginning in 1551. The meme is this, that Calvin's God was a tyrant, and the corollary to that, or corollary, depending on where you are on the globe, to that divine tyranny, is Calvin's alleged tyranny over the civil life in Geneva. Some years ago, a version of this meme or theme appeared in a Salon.com article by Chris Lehman on Joel Osteen. Lehman writes, and I quote, Osteen's serene depictions of God's eternally uptrending designs for the fates of individual believers are a sort of inverted Calvinism, where the Puritan forebears of today's Protestant scene beheld a terrible impersonal creator whose rigid system of eternal reward and punishment dispatched many an infant and solemn believer to the pit of damnation. Osteen's God is an intensely personal presence, guiding believers out of pitfalls into inevitable glory and joy, not so much a raging patriarch as a genial cruise director. This invocation of Calvin and Calvinism also appears in Molly Worthen's 2009 essay on Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. For our purposes, what is most interesting is the way that Calvin appears and the function the story plays in her narrative about the nature of the young, restless, and reformed movement. By the way, just about everything that the Salon.com article by Lehman says about Calvin or Calvinism is complete nonsense. I probably shouldn't just let that go. I sort of assume you know that, but just in case you don't, it is. The Reformed tradition's resistance to compromise and emphasis on the purity of the worshiping community has always contained the seeds of a kind of authoritarianism. Calvin had heretics burned at the stake and made a man who casually criticized him at a dinner party march through the streets of Geneva, kneeling at every intersection to beg forgiveness. This compressed account of Calvin's authority in Geneva reinforces the old and false stereotypes about Calvin, Calvinism, and the Reformed churches as inherently authoritarian and tyrannical. It feeds what P.E. Hughes called the popular fantasy of Calvin as tyrant of Geneva. Calvin was actually, as a matter of fact, more refugee than tyrant. At any rate, church-state relations in Geneva were fluid and complex. By heretics, Worthen presumably refers to the capital punishment of Miguel or Michael Servetus, who lived from about 1509 to 1553 for heresy in Geneva. Sadly, one thing that every educated person thinks that he or she knows about Calvin, to quote the novelist Anne Rice, is that, quote, Calvin was a true Christian when he burned Michael Servetus alive in Geneva, close quote. Even those who should know better sometimes position Servetus as if he were issuing a, quote, prophetic challenge to Calvin's, quote, overbearing dominance, close quote, in Geneva. Of course, the actual history is much more complicated. Servetus was a well-educated Spanish humanist, physician, and amateur theologian. He published an attack on the doctrine of the Trinity in 1530. He and Calvin corresponded, and in 1546, Calvin wrote to William Farel that should Servetus visit Geneva, he would do his best to see that the heretic did not leave alive. He also warned Servetus that should he come to Geneva, his life would be in danger. Servetus was arrested in Lyon in 1552 for having published heresy against the Catholic faith, that is, denying the Trinity, which was a capital crime. He was tried and sentenced to death, but escaped prison in Vienna, and strangely, and bizarrely, and fatally, made his way to Geneva in July of 1552. He was spotted in church, he was arrested, examined twice regarding his teaching on the Trinity. Calvin served as theological prosecutor on behalf of the city council. Servetus was convicted by a unanimous vote of the city council and a majority of the council of 200, roughly the Senate and the House, and Servetus was burned at the stake in October of 1553.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
As a matter of history, it's inescapable that Calvin played a central role in the arrest and prosecution of Servetus, but it is simply not true that Calvin killed Servetus. The city council was responsible for Servetus' death. Had Calvin objected to the death penalty, it's unlikely that the city council would have listened or could have listened. The House of Savoy was poised to invade Geneva without much provocation. Servetus was a condemned heretic. Had a Protestant city failed to put to death a notorious heretic, it would have confirmed the suspicion of Roman critics that the Protestants were nothing but crypto-fanatics, hiding their true colors under a false profession of Trinitarian orthodoxy. In fact, the killing of heretics at the stake was not uncommon under Christendom. Rome put her share of Protestants to death, including no fewer than 42,000 Reformed Christians in the period. Both Roman and Protestant magistrates killed about 3,000 Anabaptists altogether, according to Klaus Peter Clausen, over the space of about a century. The Reformed ministers in Heidelberg insisted on capital punishment of anti-Trinitarians in 1572, about which very little has been written, at least in English, and probably not in any other language. Arguably, that act was twice as heinous as the action of the Genevan civil authorities. Why then the focus on Servetus' death? This episode is singled out because it's a convenient way to vilify Calvin and reinforce the stereotype of Calvin as predestinarian monster of Geneva, and Molly Worthen's article illustrates the image of repressive Reformed churches. The 1546 episode to which Worthen refers is fairly obscure. Historian Philip Benedict says that this fellow was a member of the Petit Council. At a dinner party one evening, anticipating the modern critique of Calvin, he complained that Calvin taught false doctrine and exerted too much influence over the council. When his words found their way to Calvin, Calvin demanded action from the council, and the council decided to have this fellow apologize on bended knee to Calvin before the assembly of 200. But this was not a public penance. But this penance was not public enough to suit the pastor. He refused to present himself for the ceremony and was not satisfied until the council condemned this fellow to process through the city, kneeling at every major square or intersection to proclaim his regret at having dishonored the word of God, the magistrates, and the ministers. Now, on the surface, this seems to be another example of Calvin's alleged tyranny, but there was more happening beneath the surface. Certainly this fellow was humiliated because Calvin insisted that that's a fact. But technically, it was the city council who effected the sentence, and more importantly, it was part of a metaphorically bloody fight dating to the mid-1540s over the direction of the city of Geneva and the church. This was less about Calvin's person than it was about the authority of the church to make ecclesiastical policy. Those interested in a balanced account will notice that this fellow was made to apologize for criticizing the city's pastor, which was a public office, not for insulting Calvin's person. T.H.L. Parker says that is what was at stake, the authority of the Word of God. Calvin had only been back in Geneva since Easter of 1541, and this fellow was a member of the powerful Libertine Party, contesting the consistory's authority, and especially Calvin's. Further, this episode followed a legal and ecclesiastical case concerning this guy's wife. I'm avoiding pronouncing his last name because I'm going to butcher it. So there was some history there. Further, this guy was not an ordinary layman. He was a successful businessman who manufactured playing cards. And as I say, he was a member of the essentially city senate, the Petit Council, and was a leading member, as I say, of this Libertine Party, who didn't really want any rules or didn't want the kind of rules that the Orthodox wanted. He and others were trying to discredit Calvin and the Reformation in Geneva. According to one Calvin scholar, he was sentenced to make a circuit of the city, his head bare, a lighted torch in his hand. Now, surely this strikes us as severe today, but remember the times and the context. Was it a confusion of the civil and ecclesiastical spheres for Calvin to demand civil penalties for being identified with the sufferings of Christ? Absolutely. From the perspective of a distinction between the ecclesiastical and common spheres, Calvin might have had a case before the consistory, but not before the civil authorities. The true moral of this story, however, is the danger of the church-state alliance, we could call it Christendom, wherein civil authorities have the authority and power to punish heresy. Nowhere in the New Testament or in the moral law is theological heresy a ground for civil punishment. The only sphere authorized by God to correct theological error is the visible church. You can see that in Matthew 18. And the means of that correction are purely spiritual: word, sacrament, and discipline. For example, rebuke, censure, and possibly even excommunication. As to authoritarianism and Calvinism generally, there's a serious argument that Bruce Gordon, I, and others have advanced that Calvinism in the period was a religion of refugees, not tyrants. After all, no other group suffered more martyrs in that period than the Reformed. Remember that Calvin only came to Geneva as a refugee seeking shelter. He was expelled by the city council in 1538, and he only returned after they begged Strasbourg to release him in 1541. He stayed at the pleasure of the city council. They could have expelled him at will, but they did not. Calvin had far more influence over civil life than we are accustomed to seeing, but he was no tyrant in Geneva. He wasn't even a citizen until late in life. He was a 16th century man, and he was a theocrat, but so was everybody else in the period. The real argument here cannot reasonably be over Calvin's influence in civil affairs, or else the entire magisterial Reformation has to be convicted. Here's the moral outrage over Butzer, Melanchthon, Luther, Zwingli, Bullinger et al. It doesn't really exist. So we can fairly wonder whether something else is bothering so many moderns and late moderns.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.